So when people talk about executive functions, they usually mean the prefrontal cortex. In reality, however, there are several structures which are involved in control of executive function. This is the prefrontal cortex, of course, the anterior cingulate cortex, which many people regard as part of the prefrontal cortex and other people don't. The striatum, particularly the caudate and the putamen nuclei, and certain dopaminergic nuclei of the ventral brainstem, substantia nigra, and particularly the ventral tegmental area. So these structures work in concert to support that which we refer to as executive functions. Of course, another thing that one needs to keep in mind that people very often refer to a shorthand. People say that the prefrontal cortex is that which receives projections from the dorsomedial thalamic nucleus, or it may be defined in terms of its biochemical projections, and then people say that the prefrontal cortex is that which receives projections from the ventral tegmental area via the so-called mesocortical dopamine pathway. And on this diagram, lifted from one of my books, this diagram shows the relationship between the frontal lobe, this whole large area, and the prefrontal cortex, the much smaller area shaded more darkly. And just another kind of a preamble before we proceed. I imagine that it's a very large audience, and I imagine that the degree of prior exposure to neuropsychology is highly variable. I looked this morning at the list of participants and recognized a few names of very distinguished neuropsychologists. So, and on the other hand, I would imagine that some of the participants are less versed in neuropsychology. So I'll try to maintain some kind of middle ground, and we'll see how it goes. All right. Well, of course, the prefrontal cortex is a very large area, and people distinguish between different regions in the prefrontal cortex. They talk about the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, orbitofrontal cortex, ventromedial prefrontal cortex, frontopolar, anterior cingulate, and pars opercularis, triangularis. Let me just outline these regions on this map. So when people talk about the prefrontal cortex, they usually mean Brodmann area 9 and 46. In reality, if you want to be an anatomical purist, one should distinguish between the dorsolateral and ventrolateral. Where is my cursor? Here is my cursor, and ventrolateral. But in the literature, people very often lump them together under this term dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. One should also distinguish the frontopolar cortex, but again, in the literature, dorsolateral, ventrolateral, and frontopolar very often are lumped together under one kind of a moniker, dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which means that when you encounter this term, it may actually mean any number of things, any combination of Brodmann areas 9, 10, 46, 45. People also talk about the orbitofrontal region, Brodmann area 11, 12. People talk about the anterior cingulate cortex, Brodmann area 32. People talk about pars triangularis, Brodmann area 45, and pars opercularis, Brodmann area 44. So these are the somewhat distinct regions, functionally distinct regions of the prefrontal cortex. But again, one has to realize that there are no distinct anatomical kind of a dichotomous boundaries between these regions. So all these kind of designations are somewhat approximate. So, but these are this is the kind of a typical taxonomy of the prefrontal subdivisions. Well, what else do we know about the prefrontal cortex? We know that it's phylogenetically very young. Okay, this map, which is also lifted from one of my books, summarizes the relationship of the size of the frontal lobes to the total cortical region. And you see that it is very small in the primitive monkeys. It is somewhat larger in the so-called lesser apes. Gibbons are not monkeys, they are apes, but lesser apes. It is somewhat larger yet in the great apes, but it grows exponentially only in humans. Well, what does this phylogenetic youth connote? It sort of would lead one to believe that the prefrontal cortex is involved in some very advanced aspects of cognition, and indeed, people link the evolution of the prefrontal cortex